right. Hello and welcome to a Tuesday edition of Blind Eye Live. I am your host, Hunter King, Blind Eye himself, owner and proprietor of Blind Eye Media. And the show's starting a little late today. Had a meeting. So we're getting started a little later today. Luckily, when you're not on TV, you don't have to care about what, time you go on. Well, unless it makes the fans upset. But right now, there's only like 2 or 3 of you, so, y'all can literally just message me and I'll see it. And most of y'all watch afterwards, so whatever. So today, not going to be complicated, not a bunch of topics. I'm going to stick to one thing only. I was working on a graphic, but I suck at creating things like that. I legitimately need to get someone else to do it for me. So eventually, I'm sure I will broach this topic again in the future, closer to the time of it happening. But I'm going to lay out, and I think I can do it without any kind of visuals, explain how I think the SEC should look. I think I can explain it, and I think it will be easily understandable. So we'll get into that pretty quickly. I do want to hit some quick news stuff before we get into it, because I don't think it's going to take me that long. I know I say that a bunch, but real quick, Gronk has said that he is not ready to commit to another season. Not shocked. I don't think we're going to find out till later. Till a later date. Other than that, the only real big news is, well, in my opinion, the big news is what is going on with the Washington Commanders. So I've not really talked about this at length on the channel. Whoopsie. I've not talked about this necessarily at massive length on the channel. Sorry, I constantly mess with my camera. So Congress has been investigating the Washington Commanders because the NFL is such a massive entity. There's been tons of different allegations against the organization for different, misgivings, potential illegal acts, whatever. Well, the Commanders are denying it, or are denying that they have been kind of hiding or fudging the books on ticket revenues. The accusation was they were keeping 2 sets of books, if you will. They're denying it. But this might be the straw that breaks the camel's back for the NFL. Because, impropriety, people being mistreated in the workplace, sexual harassment, and potential worse, that's fine. But don't mess with the NFL's money. And if Washington has been cheating the rest of the league out of, revenue sharing, or out of revenue that is supposed to be shared, well, that's a massive no-no. Like, that's big time you screwed up. So this is going to be interesting to follow. Because Dan Snyder's been able to keep control of this team, and for whatever reason, and there's a lot of talk that maybe the reason Dan Snyder hadn't been booted out yet is because he's got too much dirt on certain other league owners or the league itself. We will see, but you know, I'm not convinced of anything except that Dan Snyder's an idiot, or is an idiot. And a bad owner, so of course he would do something like this. In other news, the talk about Kayvon Thibodeau and worries about his work ethic, competitive fire, things of that nature. Scouts and organizations very much seems to be a real concern with teams about, his commitment level, his culture fit. Someone's going to draft him for sure. And it's still, just because a lot of different teams have, unnamed people, but scouts and executives from a myriad of teams have come out or have, spoken to different reporters, draft analysts, stuff like that in conversations and said, like, hey, these concerns are real. Some of that could be smokescreen because teams are trying to get, him to drop far enough to him. But they could be true. But all it takes is one team to believe that you're a high-quality player. All it takes is Washington believing Dwayne Haskins is worth a first-round pick for him to go 17th overall. All it takes is the Giants thinking that Daniel Jones is a, top 10 worthy quarterback prospect to take him at number 6 overall. But it seems like these concerns are real about Kayvon Thibodeau, or at least teams legitimately believe that there are concerns with Kayvon Thibodeau. And just to be frank, and to say this, like, the word that has been most consistently used, and I've seen this from multiple different people reporting this who had multiple sources give them the same, takes or very similar takes. And the big thing that I've seen about his interviews are they were poor. And this was something I've been worried about especially since he did that sit-down interview with Joel Klatt for Fox Sports. That interview already started him off on the wrong foot, and apparently he has done nothing to dissuade that. And the word that I'm hearing out of these interviews was, if anything, he's made those concerns even more apparent with his interviews. Now, some guy or not doing great in the interview process, whatever, that guy could still, there are guys who still work out. Like, and some guys had big red flags that even showed up early in their careers and they get past it. Look at Randy Gregory. And I'm not comparing Thibodeau to Gregory. Like, they had very different, issues. And Thibodeau's a more gifted prospect. But red flags are red flags, and there's a lot of teams are seeing, at the very least, yellow and orange with Thibodeau. So that's a big thing. There is no consensus right now on who the top tackle is. Like, it seems like there's a big split in the league over whether Evan Neal or Ike Ekwonu is the top offensive tackle in the league, or in this draft. And there's some debate over whether the gap is bigger between them and Charles Cross or Charles Cross and Trevor Penning. Personally, I think Cross is. I have Cross rated right there with them. Like, I have him a step below because I think we haven't seen as much of his run blocking on tape, although when he was asked to be a move blocker in the screen game and run game, like, he looked has some nasty tape in those scenarios. But Neal and Okwonu were asked to, or were in more balanced offenses. Those guys have played some guard too. Of course, Evan Neal has played guard, right tackle, left tackle. Neal has even said, I don't care where I play. Play me at guard, play me at tackle. I'm a beast. I'm kind of adding the second part there, but I mean, he is a beast. So's Okwonu. I do have some issues with, like, there's some things Okwonu needs to iron out in pass protection, and that's why I actually have Neal above Okwonu at this point. And I have Charles Cross right below them because I think Cross is the best pass protector out of each of them. And at this point, that's more than half your offense. You're passing the ball more than half the time. And for particularly a left tackle, I'm still pretty sure that most teams run more to the right and up the middle than they do to the left. Like, for a tackle, I really care more about pass protection than run blocking. Which is why I don't have Cross as low. And I don't understand why some people have Cross as low as they do. Like, I really don't. He's an awesome athlete. But I think it does depend on scheme. Like, if you are more of a very balanced team, maybe you do worry that Cross doesn't have as much run blocking tape. I don't think that's as big a concern. I think he's fine, and I think he's obviously extremely coachable. And I think if you're a zone running team, his athleticism should, should jump out to you. Same with Okwonu, same with Neal. All three of these guys, like, are easy movers. Okwonu's got some real explosion. Like, this guy is really good. This guy makes reach blocks from the left tackle position on tape that are just incredible. Like, getting over in front of, like, four eyes and three techniques from outside. And sealing them off, making massive cutback lanes for running backs. Or for his running back. So, like, I think these three offensive tackles are as good of a top three as we've seen in any draft, period. That's my opinion. I don't think I have as high a grade on any of... Like, I'll say this. Neal is the closest one to, like, my best graded tackle prospect over the past 5 years, which is Tristan Wirfs. He was my number one tackle for 2020. I didn't think he was going to go first because of everything I was hearing. I was hearing a lot about Andrew Thomas, Mekhi Becton, his size and everything. I thought he'd go earlier, and I wasn't going to be shocked when Jedrick Wills went earlier because he was from Alabama, and he looked really solid at Bama. So, and Wirfs did. He went off the board fourth. He was my number one. And Wirfs has been awesome. I mean, he slid into right tackle, but every year the distinction between left and right tackle doesn't matter as much. Right tackle, I think, usually has a little more run responsibility, or, that's wanted a little more at right tackle. But so many teams line their best pass rusher up now on that side of the formation to attack that right tackle. So, and Wirfs has been, he's been among the best in the league since he stepped foot on an NFL field, basically. And I truly think Evan Neal Evan Neal has the ability to be the same way. I do have some issues with Ekwonu being a little too aggressive in his pass sets, leaning in and kind of leaning towards and playing his pass sets a little too much like he plays in the run game, which if you look at the Florida State tape from this past year, their pass rushers got after him all day long. But that can be coached out. But Charles Cross doesn't have that issue in pass protection, and I care more about pass protection than run blocking for tackles. But I think Ekwonu is so good in the run game, and he still, when he does get his hands on you in pass protection, I still think he's probably a higher upside player. You can also play him at guard, and he'd be an elite guard. And if he was a guard, he'd be a top 5 prospect still. That's kind of my thing with Ekwonu. Whereas Cross, he's a tackle. And he's still going to, for a lot of teams, have to answer about run blocking. I think he's going to be solid, but the pass protection's there. I think he's just as good. Or I think he's the best out of the 3 at that. And that's why I have him as my 5th rated prospect. I don't understand the people that have him like... I barely understand the people who have him 15th, let alone the people who have him like 20th. And I'd seen some people like with him down in like 23rd. Like, I just don't get it. Like, I don't see how you could see that level of pass protection from a guy at Mississippi State. Like, he's going up against the best of the best, week in and week out, pass rushers. I mean, he had to deal with Anderson and Turner, among others, for Alabama last year. He had to deal with Clemens and DeMarvin Leal from A&M. Mostly Clemens, though. And Clemens is a really underrated player that I think he's probably going to go on day 3. Oh, I think he's going to go on day 3. I really like him as a rotational edge player to start off his career. I think he's got some upside. I really like his tape at A&M. Not as much as a bunch of the guys that I have ranked ahead of him, obviously, but I think Clemens has more juice on the field than and he I don't hear anyone talking about him because I don't think he stayed in college. I'm pretty sure he's in this draft class. Last time I checked, he was. So, but Cross held up so good against so many people. Sam Williams of Ole Miss, who another guy I really, really love, extremely explosive. I would say obviously he ran like, I think, a 1/10 of a second slower or close to it than Amari Barno out of Virginia Tech. Williams has much better tape. He's a more skilled pass rusher at this stage, and he's way better against the run. And Williams is probably going to go 3rd round. Some people, I think, even have him as a day 3 guy. And he could. I mean, there's a ton of guys in that kind of wash area. But anyway, that's enough about the tackles. I guess I'm going to drown on the Sam Howell, what seems to be the Sam Howell emergency raft. I'm just floating out in the ocean here. Like, apparently, like Kuiper's moved Carson Strong ahead of him. Yeah, he's got a little bit of a longer release. I don't know. I love the way Howell plays. I love his aggressiveness. I think his tape from his first 2 years was better than this year. But there were things he showed this year that he wasn't asked to do in previous years. He was in a worse situation this year. I think if you came into the year with him as your top quarterback, like So many people did. Well, other than the morons that had Spencer Rattler up there as their number one quarterback. And yes, I say morons because after his first year, Spencer Rattler did not look like. And you could talk about projection and improvement, whatever. We've just seen this year with a number of these guys. Keaton Slovis was a guy who a lot of people had in the first round. Got hurt, he's dealt with some injuries. Like, he's now kind of dropped down. Ritter's held strong. Malik Willis came into the year with a lot of hype, and it kind of fell, and now it's risen back, which I'm not shocked because of the tools. But, and I mean, Kenny Pickett came out of nowhere for a lot of people. I mean, I say nowhere, like this guy was a day 3 guy, and, he might be the first quarterback drafted. Matt Corral came in the year with some hype because, he had some really bad lows in year 1, in 2020, but he had some really high highs, and this year was extremely efficient, although he got a little lucky to not have more interceptions than he did. I'm just going to be real with you. He could have had a lot more interceptions. Which, because he had so few, I can literally say, this guy could have had 6 to 7 times the interception. Because I think he ended up with 1 interception the whole season. I think in watching his film from this year, I think he easily could have had 7, 8 interceptions. Or let's say somewhere between 6 and 8. And that's not saying that if every interceptable pass had been intercepted. I'm saying if you go by the usual rate of interceptions to interception-worthy throws, you're looking at a much higher rate than he ended up with. But he still did a much better job of taking care of the ball this year. I'm not going to change or, go sideways on that. I'm not saying he didn't improve a lot. I think Matt Corral has traits and skills where there's a reason he's my number 3 quarterback in this class. But I've kind of moved around because Howell's still my QB1. That's not gonna change. And Pickett's my QB2. But all of these guys are super close together. I've got Ritter 4 and Willis 5. I think Willis has incredible upside. He's gonna have to prove it. I don't have the same vibe with him that I had with Mahomes. I don't have the same vibe with him that people had, or even I had with Josh Allen. I don't have as high opinion of him as I had of Lamar Jackson. I had a higher opinion of Lamar Jackson than most quarterback evaluators that year. Because I thought Lamar Jackson was a top 10 player in the class, who I had ranked ahead of Josh Allen. So, but it does seem like Howell I don't think Howell's going to go round 1 unless there is a team that's in love with him. I'd be super happy if the Titans were in love with Sam Howell and draft him in the first round to study behind Tannehill, because I think he does need a little bit of time. I wouldn't be as thrilled with Desmond Ridder, but I think Ridder would be a great fit for our offense. Of course, you wish there was a home run guy that you could go after, but I think both of those are really good developmental guys. I just think Howell has a higher ceiling than Ridder. Might have a lower floor, though. So, But it's tough with the quarterbacks this year. I'll say with the Saints moving up, there's talk that the Saints, at 18, one of the reasons they brought back Winston, brought in Andy Dalton, was they weren't convinced that they were going to have a shot at the guy they wanted at 18. Now, they only moved up to 16, but maybe since they made those moves, some things have changed. I think a lot of people around the league seem convinced now that Carolina is going to draft a quarterback. I'm not, because that quarterback, he's going to have some great receivers. They need a left tackle so bad. Like, I'd argue that it doesn't matter who the quarterback is. If they don't improve that offensive line group, if they don't improve that left tackle spot now, it doesn't matter who's at quarterback. They're going to have the same problem Sam Darnold did last year. Same problem Sam Darnold did last year. Because Darnold had weapons. But the offensive line sucked. Outside of Taylor Moton, the rest of the line was average or worse. At the very least, 3 of the positions of that line were below average. Because I still think Matt Parody was solid at center. Maybe I'm wrong there. But outside of Taylor Moton, I mean, they probably didn't have an above average player at any spot on their line other than Moton. And if you look at their rushing and passing numbers, if you look at the pass block and run block win rates, it bears out that their offensive line was really poor, one of the poorest in the league. I think they need Charles Cross. And I think you rolled the dice because I think the quarterbacks are grouped so closely for me. And I'm looking at their scheme. I think you could get Desmond Ridder or Sam Howell at their second round pick potentially. And if not, I don't think they're going to be that good anyway this year. Regardless of that, I still think there's a lot of gaps in their roster. Yeah, their offense has some really good skill position talent. I do see some talent on some young talent on their defense. But I don't know if a rookie quarterback, even a really ready rookie quarterback, if he doesn't have a left tackle, is going to do much of anything. Like, if you don't shore up that other tackle spot. And they drafted, I think it was Brady Christensen out of BYU last year, who I like. Maybe you think he can step into that spot. But I don't know if he's going to be an above-average player. I know if you get Charles Cross, or by the end of the season, he's going to be an above-average player at the position. Now, I could be wrong, and he could be like Andrew Thomas. And, a lot of people thought Andrew Thomas was the safest tackle out of the bunch. And it took Andrew Thomas until year 2 to show, oh, yeah, this dude's a bona fide stud. Like, Andrew Thomas looked bad in year 1. Or looked kind of rough in year 1. Popped in year 2. We'll see. I mean, you never know. But I think Charles Cross is going to come in, and I think he's a surefire pick. That's who the Panthers need. I think they're going to go quarterback, and I think they're going to put a rookie quarterback in a bind if they draft one at 6. Which that means that's going to be Pickett or Willis based on what I'm seeing from around the league. Those are the consensus top 2. From there, Seattle could draft a rookie. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they'd ride with Drew Lock instead of drafting a quarterback in this class. That's the sense I'm getting. Atlanta, I don't think Atlanta's drafting a quarterback. If they do, I think it would be Kenny Pickett. Maybe it would be Malik Willis. But I'm not convinced. Oh, hey, cat. You're like right under my feet. I'm not convinced that Atlanta's taking quarterback. And so I've gotten off on draft talk before I get into the SEC thing, but whatever. The Atlanta could go quarterback, but I think them signing Marcus Mariota, I think they're legitimately going to give him a shot. And they're still very much in a rebuild. They're tearing things down. They're going to try and compete. They're going to try and be like the Lions. Yeah, the Lions had the number 2 pick. But by the end of the season, like, there's an energy around the around program. It's the college football coming out with me. Or there's an energy around the organization. Everybody feels like they made progress around the league. There is a culture. There is buy-in. They're building something. Atlanta, I think, is trying to do the same thing. I think they're going to be aggressive in going after a quarterback in next year's draft, potentially, unless Mariota pops. I think Arthur Smith is going to try and do with Mariota what he wasn't necessarily able to do with him in Tennessee, but he's going to try and do with a older, more seasoned Mariota what he did with Ryan Tannehill. And now Mariota doesn't have the expectations that he had in Tennessee. This is it's a new day. It's a fresh start. Kind of like with Ryan Tannehill when he went from Miami to Tennessee. And I like Mariota better as a prospect than I like Tannehill as a prospect, which everybody did, to be fair. So I think that's where Atlanta's going this year. I don't think they're drafting a quarterback. Like I said, Seattle at 9. Don't think it's happening. Washington's not drafting a quarterback now. They believe that they're, as Ron Rivera put it, they're an ascending team with Carson Wentz at quarterback. They're not worried about a rook. Minnesota's not going to draft a quarterback at 12. Houston's not drafting a quarterback this year. They're going to give Davis Mills a shot. Unless they really swerve on everyone, and no one believes that they're taking a quarterback this year. At 4 or 13. At 3 or 13. The Eagles aren't taking a quarterback. They're rolling with Hurts this year. He did show some progress last year. Like, they made the playoffs. They believe they can get more out of him, and they could. Like, Hurts could develop layers to his game that some of us don't foresee. I'm not bullish on that. And then you've got the Saints. And this is my thing. You've also got the potential of people trading up. I think the Steelers are a prime team that could trade up. I'd argue, I think the Saints moved up to 16 because I think they're going to try and use one of those first-round picks to move up in the draft for a quarterback if they're wanting to get if they're really wanting to get a certain quarterback. Like a guy that they want to develop. See, I've had Matt Corral there for a long time, but I see how Kenny Pickett would fit. And with Winston and Dalton there, you've got 2 vets for Willis to sit behind and learn things from, and 2 very disparate types of quarterback. But I really think for the Saints, it's probably going to come down to, unless a swerve, I think the top 2 quarterbacks on their board are Pickett and Corral. And maybe even Ritter. I just don't feel like Willis is the guy that they're looking for. In their offense. I could be wrong. But the Steelers have done extensive work. The only quarterback who Mike Tomlin, like their head of college scouting, their GM, and their head coach were not at their pro day was Sam Howell. And the only person missing was Mike Tomlin because of the NFL's annual meetings, which they're no longer calling the owners' meetings. They're just calling the NFL annual meeting. So, which the owners and coaches attend. But the GM and the head of college scouting were still at Sam Howell's pro day. I still think Willis is their top guy, for sure. And I think the Steelers at a certain point will be aggressive about moving up for him if they really believe in him. But they've done extensive work on all of the top quarterbacks. I even think all three of them were at Carson Strong's pro day, if that's happened already. Because I know they... But if it wasn't Strong, it was still the top 5 as was in the article I was reading at the time. So I know for a fact they were at Ritter, Pickett, Willis, Corral. So, and then some other teams that maybe end up falling kind of in that quarterback mix in round 1. I mean, because those are the big ones: Carolina, potentially Atlanta, potentially Seattle, New Orleans, and Pittsburgh. I really don't see any other teams. Obviously, the Texans could surprise us all. And I still think it would be a real surprise if the Seahawks drafted a quarterback. Because I think Atlanta's the wild card, but I really think Carolina's seriously going to consider it with the 6th pick, and if they don't at 6, they'll consider it with their 2nd round pick. And I wouldn't be... Well, wait, they don't have a 2nd round or 3rd round picks. I just remembered that. So that's the other big thing. If they take a quarterback, they're not getting a left tackle. They don't have a 2nd or 3rd round pick. They're not getting a guy they could potentially plug in and play. Not that there's a guy that projects as that at the top of the 2nd round necessarily either, or at left tackle. I don't know. I think I just think that's a little unlikely. And to be honest, I think the Panthers, this is a consequential year for them. Their GM did do an interview where he was talking about, you got to do something quarterback, but you hate to force it because when you force it, things tend to go wrong. And that's kind of my thing. None of us are convinced that there is a bona fide stud quarterback prospect. Like, they all have question marks. And the one that I'm willing to, I guess, I'm willing to go out on the limb for is Sam Howell. Although I think I like Pickett a lot. I just don't have him rated as highly as any of the top 5 quarterbacks from last year. And Mac Jones went 15th overall. I think Willis is a risky prospect. Some people would rather take the risk on the guy having the elite tools and being able to coach up the mental aspects and harness those tools because they've got this bigger outcome. I'd rather lean towards Pickett, where I think we're underselling his traits. And the guy just put an awesome season on tape. Although you got to take into account, maybe some of that was Jordan Addison, his top receiver, who won the Blitnikoff Award, earned the Blitnikoff Award. He had a great season, really broke out as a sophomore. Maybe that had a lot to help with that. But, Pickett, 42 touchdowns is 42 freaking touchdowns. And he didn't play in a bowl game, or he didn't play in the bowl game. Like, they won an ACC title. Pitt won an ACC title. So, and they played a really good schedule on the way to doing that. He played some really, really good teams. And some teams that were surprisingly good in some cases. Like Wake Forest, who they beat in the ACC title game. And Clemson, the problem with Clemson was their offense. It was not their defense. They were a great defensive team. So, anyway. Of course, with Ritter, it's... And some of these guys, it is age. Like Pickett and Ritter are on the older side. Or at least, like, they're super experienced. But... And for Ritter, he's been good, but he hasn't played quite the same, like, competition level as maybe some other guys. Like Willis, you know, his competition level was lower, but also his supporting cast was lower than some of these other guys. Howell, you know, you could say started big. His last year wasn't great. I'm going to put that on the situation around him rather or more so than on him. I mean, there's just questions about everybody. So, and then for Carson Strong, a lot of it's medical. And you could say level of play, you know, in the Mountain West, but that didn't hold down Jordan Love's stock. That didn't hold down, or, I mean, Colin Kaepernick played at Nevada, and I really liked him as a prospect coming out. He came out in 2011, same year as Cam Newton. Was a second-round pick like Andy Dalton, who Andy Dalton was at TCU, was also in the Mountain West at the time. You know, those two guys were, you know, quality starting quarterbacks. So, but for Strong, I think it really is, it's the medical, it's his knee that people are super concerned about. And he's got some little things, and he's not the most mobile. Like, out of all these guys, he's easily the least mobile. I think his mobility is less than that of Mac Jones. And I thought Mac Jones' functional ability was actually higher than he was getting credit for. So, that being said, that's kind of news and notes for today on that. We're going to get into the big topic for the show, and that is SEC realignment. Texas and Oklahoma are joining the SEC. This is happening. SEC is going to a 16-team league. And a lot of people are worried about, well, how are we going to do this? Like, are we just going to have 2 8-team divisions? I mean, we play 8 conference games as it is. Like, it's right now, the way our stuff is set up, it takes you 12 years to do a home and home with every team in the conference who's not in your division. Considering each team has like a cross-division rival that they play every year. Like for Tennessee and Alabama play each other every year. Florida LSU play each other every year. Auburn, Georgia play each other every year. This has got to shift. And I started off with this idea like, okay, we're going to keep the 8-game conference schedule. We've got to drop the 8-game. And I'm going to lay this out, and I guess I'll lay this out in order. My proposal, and I'm praying this is what the SEC's going with, and from what I hear, they're kicking, at least this part of my idea around. The SEC moves from a 2-division structure to a 4-division structure, or quadrants. So you've got 4-team pods. That the way I would organize them is somewhat regionally, and I think there could be some quibbling, and that's fine. This is the way I would lay it out because it has some regional, or it kind of makes sense from a regional perspective, and I think also from a rivalry perspective as we go throughout the process, I think this will work. So there would be a Southeast Division, which would be Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and Auburn. That means that Florida, Georgia, Auburn, Georgia rivalries, they're in the division, done. You get Florida, Auburn back. That used to be, back in the day, an annual matchup or a more often matchup back before the last bit of expansion. But I believe they played every year back under the 12-team format. I might be wrong, but I remember during the Urban Meyer era of Florida, the Florida-Auburn games were classics. That's a game that I want back. That's a game that I do want annually. And then you throw South Carolina in there. For the next division, and once again, I think this works out regionally. Some people are going to be mad about this one, I think, but hear me out. So then you've got Kentucky, Vandy, Tennessee, Alabama. That makes sure that Tennessee and Alabama play every year, which that rivalry can't go anywhere. And there are other ways you can orient this to where this could happen. This is just a proposal because it's more about the structure than completely where the teams are. Yes, that means Alabama gets to play Vanderbilt and Kentucky. Kentucky's not necessarily a pushover anymore. Yes, that puts Alabama and Vanderbilt in the same division. Vandy's got to be in someone's division. And this, once again, just kind of reasonably makes sense. So, obviously, those teams, they play each other every year. The next division, we're going to call it, maybe we call it the Mississippi Division. I mean, you could call them whatever. You've got the Mississippi schools, Ole Miss, Mississippi State. You've got LSU. And originally, I was going to do Missouri, but I put Arkansas in this one. Because it does fit a little more regionally, and I decided by process of elimination, that means all the former Big 12 schools, Missouri, Texas, Texas A&M, and Oklahoma, are all together in that division. Which it just kind of makes sense for those schools to play each other every year. And then, beyond that, I'm expanding this, or then you'd have a 9-game conference schedule. Now, a lot of people don't want that. It's just got to be done. We're going to 9 games. People are like, oh, that's going to be a harder road to the national title, the SC title. It's going to be harder to go undefeated or get through a schedule even with 1 loss. Oh, well. Guess what? If it's really that hard, and we've kind of seen it anyway with how the committee goes, and the BCS too, that SEC schedule, the team strength, people are going to take that into account. People are going to you are not what your record says you are. You are what your record relative to your opponent says you are. That's what I live by. I'm sorry, UTSA, when they were undefeated last year, which they ended up losing 2 games at the end of the season, which Coastal Carolina, they ended up not going undefeated. BYU that same year lost to Coastal Carolina. Coastal Carolina ended up losing to Liberty. you know, those records aren't as strong as like a 2-loss SEC team. Let's just be real. Like, yeah, everybody looks at A&M and Arkansas's records like, yeah, but they lost such and such games. One, Arkansas kind of got the Ole Miss game stolen from them by the refs. Mississippi State should have had a win over Memphis last year. And then A&M, they caught lightning in a bottle. Zach Calzada decided to play his best game of the season against Alabama. And the defense really stepped up in that game. So, like, they had the ability to beat Alabama. I'm just saying, you know, Cincinnati played that same Alabama team and got floored. I mean, Michigan won the Big Ten. They got a mud hole stomped in them by Georgia. I mean, it just kind of seems like the SEC's tougher. It's harder. So we're going to a 9-game schedule, and that allows us to lock in 3 more teams that you will play every year, and this allows us to save a bunch of rivalries. So Alabama's going to get to play Auburn every year. We're going to get Florida LSU still. We're going to get, and how about I just kind of run through it? So this is the way I looked at it, and I went through some of the more important, rivalry games. And of course, as a Tennessee fan, I started there because this is kind of my dream scenario would be Tennessee would lock in Florida, Georgia, and just outright. And then I'm not sure who the 6th team would be right now. Or, I mean, the 3rd, like, out-of-pod team would be. But that locks in Florida and Georgia. Florida, obviously, would have LSU and Tennessee. And you could figure out that 3rd team. Whether you wanted to be Kentucky, which those games have been really good recently, or someone else. But this allows us to get back. This scenario allows us to get back Auburn and Florida make Florida Auburn every year, and keeps Florida LSU, Florida Tennessee. The real tough one has been like LSU, because trying to and balancing some of these games, because there's been some LSU's had. You want to keep LSU Alabama. So what this allows us to do, Arkansas is in there, that pod with LSU already. LSU A&M has turned into one of the hottest rivalries in college football. I want to keep that. This allows us to keep LSU Alabama. And you've got LSU Florida. LSU Auburn becomes like, an every now and again thing. Kind of stinks, but I don't think that's been as stiff a rivalry. Like, I would say the A&M LSU rivalry has been a much bigger thing. LSU Alabama obviously is, and LSU Florida obviously is. So, like, LSU, like, they were an easy one. Like, these are the games I've got to have. For Alabama, like, it was, obviously we got to keep LSU Alabama. That game's big time. And then Alabama Auburn, obviously, because some people would be like, you'd want to put them in the same pod. Under this scenario, you don't have to have them because they're going to play each other every year regardless. And then you take, I would argue, I really want A&M to play Alabama every year, but I'm willing to give on that if A&M's like, you mean to tell me we're going to have to play LSU, we're going to have to play Alabama, we're going to have to play Arkansas, because I want A&M and Arkansas to play every year. We're going to have to play Texas, and we're going to have to play OU. like that does seem pretty imbalanced. And that's the thing. Like I'm willing to talk some things out. It's more about the structure and the ideas here. So, I've kind of explained kind of the idea of like how we would have your pod that you play every year. You have 3 other teams that you play every year. And then that leaves 3 more games for the remaining 9 teams in the conference. Because remember, the 16-team conference. So obviously you count as one of the teams. You've got now 6 other teams on your schedule that you're playing. So that's 7 teams obviously accounted for. Leaves the other 9 teams in the conference. You've got 3 slots. So guess what? Now it's even, because right now it's not. Now you've got an even spread of 3 spaces for these teams. You play all the teams in the SEC in a 6-year window right now, or under this scenario. A home and home with each team within every 6 years. So like the way that I've got it set up, since I have LSU set up with all of their rivalries. Obviously, you've got Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Arkansas every year. You've got Alabama, A&M, and Florida every year, which LSU probably sitting here like, man, what a murderer's row. I mean, this SEC is a murderer's row regardless. Like, ugh. Then you've got, for a rotation of, let's see, the first 2 years, we're talking 2024, 2025, you've got, let's say, Vanderbilt, South Carolina, and Missouri. Let's say Vanderbilt, South Carolina, and Texas. Because once again, these schedules are going to be tough anyway because it's going to get balanced out because the teams that you're not guaranteed to play, you're still going to be rotating in other good teams or bad teams if you're in maybe a tougher, locked-in group. But let's say you've got, like I said, we'll go Kentucky, South Carolina, Missouri. One from each of the other 3 pods or what have you for like that first 2 years. The next 2 years, you'd play Texas, Vanderbilt, and Auburn. And then that would be 26-27. And then in 28-29, you've got Tennessee, Georgia, and Oklahoma. Or however, like I had it. Basically, because LSU's got one. For LSU, it's kind of simple because you've got one team from each of the other pods that you're playing constantly. That might not be the case for everyone because, like, for Tennessee, Georgia and Florida are locked in. And then you could pick, like, another team from another pod. Maybe it's Missouri. Maybe you decide to make Tennessee, Texas a yearly thing. I'd be okay with that. Maybe you just decide to lock in South Carolina as the other one. All 3 of Tennessee's teams come from that, or outside of their pod, come from that pod. Because we played each other so much over the years being East rivals, but I don't know if I don't really look at that as much of a rivalry game because we typically win. Like, I'm pretty sure that's a pretty lopsided record right now between the 2 teams. But I'd be okay with a bunch of different teams, like, being our third. But there's some rivalries that I want to make sure I preserve as many of the biggest and most important ones as possible. And I think regionally speaking, Auburn, Florida is a little more of a thing than Auburn, LSU. And maybe I'm wrong. But I just remember those games being really good. And I just think from a regional standpoint, all those teams kind of fit really good. because that's another thing with this model. I think things are kind of regionally make a lot of sense. Missouri's just in an interesting spot, to be quite frank. Because I think there'd be some people that would want to put Arkansas with the three more prominent former Big 12 teams, maybe throw Missouri, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, and Tennessee in a pod, but that seems like a weak pod. And then you'd have LSU, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and Alabama together. Maybe you're wanting to have Alabama and Auburn in the same one. But I don't love that prospect either. I think this is the best one from like a regional standpoint and be able to kind of pull rivalries around. So, I mean, because for Tennessee, like the Kentucky game, like that's I-75 rivalry right there. You know, for the longest time, it was a one-sided rivalry. Now it's definitely more competitive. And Kentucky, of course, stole our checkerboards, you know, because they don't have an original bone in their body up there. But I really respect what Mark Stoops is doing with the program. I think that's a game that has to stay. And it just kind of makes sense for us, regionally speaking, to be in the same pod. Same with Vanderbilt, you know, I-40 rivalry, in-state rivalry. As you know, unfortunately, it's been a little closer recently because of the failings of previous coaching staffs. But, you know, now I don't look at that game as a game we're going to have to worry about for the foreseeable future with the current administration we have. Like Vanderbilt, just football-wise, is going to be behind everyone. And unfortunately for Vandy, it looks like they're losing ground. They're about to start losing ground in other areas too. Because right now, everybody's caught up to them in baseball and is surpassing them in baseball right now. And they are not happy about it. But to kind of sum it up again, like the way I think we solve kind of this realignment quandary is you have to expand the season to 9 conference games. It just has to be done. We need to go with quadrants instead of divisions, or the 2 divisions. And I say you have 3 of your 6 non-pod games as locked-in games to keep rivalries together, and then it makes it really easy to rotate through the other 9 schools, you know, in a 6-year period. Now, you could say, you know, maybe some of the rivalries aren't every year anymore, but if you've got 6 rotating games, you can get through the other 12 schools in 4 years. I still like the idea of having more games that are every year and rotating on the 6-year schedule. Because some games really don't matter as much as others. I would much rather have these other games like every year. I think that's a good price to pay. And once again, if you expand a 9-game season, it makes scheduling super easy and simple, as it should be. And then this gives you some exciting ideas because now everybody's like, well, how do you decide the championship game? I think it's really easy. Because you have the one answer, which is you still take the 2 best teams with the best SEC record. But that's not how I would do it. Because the best way to do it is now the SEC has its own little playoff. Now, see, this is what the kind of idea of, if we're going to talk about playoff expansion, how about we do it this way? Instead of expanding the national playoff, bigger conferences, why not have your 4 best teams, the winners of each quadrant of the SEC, play in a tournament? What would happen here is maybe you take away one of the non-conference games off the schedule. So now you're playing non-conference games, 2 non-conference games. And maybe you don't do that either. Maybe you just say, look, we're going to maybe we decide to start our season a week earlier. Because I would argue, and I think this would be good for college football in general, that whole week 0 thing that's been going on, how about we just start week 0, and how about we kick the end of the regular season or like the championship game a week back into December. That'll allow us to maybe add an extra bye week in here. Just saying. And then what we do conference championship week is we have a playoff and an invitational. So every SEC team who didn't make the playoff, or the conference championship playoff, you just take seeds 2 through 4 in every division, and maybe you just pit a bunch of them against each other. It's not another playoff, like it's just one game. But maybe that you could do, it's like you could do that as the last week of the season instead of doing a third non-conference game, or you still play the 12-game season and do this. Just an idea. Maybe you don't do the other part of it, but I think you take the best team from each quadrant and you put them in a playoff for the SEC championship. And then whoever wins these 2 semifinal matchups, they play in the title game. I think it's a great idea because it also improves all those teams' strengths of schedule. But that's just a thought. But to me, this solves the playoff expansion dilemma because there's a lot of people wanting, more teams to get a shot. I don't like the idea of expanding the playoff because I don't think it needs, the college football playoff itself doesn't need to be expanded. What I think is we maybe need a way of a better way of selecting it, or maybe thinning the field at the very end. And if every conference was to do something like this, or like the bigger conferences for sure, because like one of the issues for everybody with the SEC has been, well, they're getting 2 teams in too often. It's like, well, the SEC's got 2 of the 4 best teams just about every year, or 2 of the 5 best teams pretty much every year. Heck, in 2020, you could argue 3. Well, I mean, coming down to the stretch of the season, going to the SEC title game, everybody had Alabama in, and then Florida and A&M were 5 and 6. One, this SEC playoff would probably thin out the college football playoff, discussion for the SEC, and would likely make sure that there were 3 other spots for teams from other conferences. Now that still is, well, that means that, the group of 5 conferences are still having to battle it out against these other conferences that there's bias towards. And I'm like, well, what bias? The Pac-12 just got left out for the AAC. And the Pac-12 had already been kind of feeling like they were getting left out. Like they were being put behind definitely the Big Ten and the ACC, which really the Big Ten and Clemson. But the ACC didn't make it this year. The Big 12, they've found themselves on the outside looking in a bit. Or for multiple years. Multiple years out of this thing. They didn't get a team this year either. Like this is the crazy thing. 3 of the Power 5 conferences didn't make it, but Cincinnati out of the American Athletic Conference did. And the 5th team in discussion was Notre Dame. Like Notre Dame was the 5th team. And then I think 6th was Baylor. So, and people can once again whine about there being two SEC teams. Everybody everybody in their honest heart of hearts knows that Georgia and Alabama were the two best teams in college football last year. And they proved it. Michigan and Cincinnati were the obvious other two teams. Like, those were the obvious four best teams in the country that played in the playoff. And Georgia and Alabama absolutely handled Michigan and Cincinnati in those semifinals. You could have flipped those two teams, or you could have flipped those two matchups for Georgia and Alabama, and it probably would have been similar. And I'd say it would have been very similar results. Michigan probably gives Bama a better game than Cincinnati did. But who knows? But I'm going to say pretty similar results. The Pac-12 just needs to get better. I talked about it yesterday. They've got to invest like the rest of the country has been. The Big Ten West, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota. They're going to continue to be where they've been the last few years if they don't find some kind of way to push into a higher strata. If they're okay with where they are and being kind of contenders and just, getting a shot and maybe making that shot every so often when they get it, that's fine. But I think Penn State, like Michigan State, is definitely up in the ante. I think Penn State administration this year realized they've got to up the ante, and they re-upped, extended, and gave James Franklin a raise with some big incentives. And I think they're going to invest in some stuff that they haven't been willing to go as all in on as Ohio State and Michigan. Those teams are going to have to keep up. Obviously, everyone in the SEC has been up in the ante for themselves. Tennessee is upping the ante. And Tennessee's has been a big spender for a long time, and they're upping from what they were. And they're upping their spending in sports outside of football, too. And then you don't think that Oklahoma and Texas are investing? Like, holy crap. So that's two more high investment programs going to the SEC. You know how UCF and Cincinnati have gotten to where they are? And Houston. Houston signed the former West Virginia coach they hired away from there. I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. But they hired him away from West Virginia a couple years ago for big money. It was like the biggest contract for any coach not in the Power 5. And bigger than a lot of Power 5 coaches were getting. And it was bigger than the contract he was getting at West Virginia. It was a significant raise from what he was getting at West Virginia. Houston's investing. BYU is joining the Big 12. And they've boosted investing again recently. It is an arms race. And I think Oregon got a little lackadaisical. As highly invested as they are. There are some cool perks around there, and there are things that they had at Oregon. Miami decided to ante up to get Mario Cristobal. And I think that signaled that they're heavily invested again. More so than they've been in, or since those big sanctions happened, because of the stuff with that Shapiro dude. What was it, Nathan Shapiro? Anyway. I think Miami's investing in a way they haven't in over 15 years in their program. So, I don't know. For me, personally, if I'm looking at because I know I've gotten off the SEC part of this, but I think the Big 12's like going to be back to 12 teams with this move. The Big 10's at 14 teams. I think the Big 10 needs to make a push to jump to 16 teams and do exactly what I'm proposing with the SEC. And I think they could do that I think they could pull some teams from the MAC to do that. And I think they could consider jettisoning Rutgers during that process too. Maybe they don't, and they probably don't want to do that, but you've got some teams in the MAC that you could consider to throw in to come to or to make it to 16 teams. Because I would be very much looking at, out of that group, you're looking at Western Michigan, Central Michigan, Toledo, Northern Illinois, University of Ohio, or Miami of Ohio, maybe Kent State. Like, but I think that's kind of where you're going, unless you wanted to reach outside and expand the conference, geographically. And to be honest, if I was Nebraska, I might be looking to try and get out of the Big 10 and go back to the Big 12, personally, in the future. I think it'd be interesting if Iowa State left the Big 12 and joined the Big 10. Like maybe they traded Nebraska and Iowa State. Just a thought. I think that would probably benefit the Big, because I think it would benefit Nebraska and Iowa State. I don't know how the conference would see, if they would see it as beneficial to the conferences, but whoop, I just hooked the camera wire again. I gotta change my setup this weekend. But I would like to, and I hate to say this, but like at this point, there's so many teams, because there aren't teams leaving the FBS for the most part. There are teams jumping up though, and the Conference USA right now is being kind of torn apart, because as the Big 12, is expanding and pulling teams, they just took three teams from the American Athletic Conference. Well, the American Athletic Conference just pulled like 6 teams from, I think it was the Conference USA, and another team. Well, I know the Conference USA's got like 6 teams leaving, and I think they're all going to the American Athletic Conference. I'm trying to remember, but they're going to be a 14-team league after this, or all this realignment. The Sun Belt is going to be up to like 12 teams. The Conference USA is going to be down teams. The MAC's staying the same. The Mountain West is staying the same. But I'd argue the top half of the Mountain West should probably be looking to move. Like, I'd argue that they should be kind of looking at the Big 12 and the Pac-12 and deciding which directions they want to go. And in those teams, I'm talking like Boise State, San Diego State, Nevada, Air Force, Utah State, maybe Colorado State. There's another team, I think, that I'm blanking on the name of right now. But I think San Diego State and Boise State would fit great in the Pac-12. They'd become the Pac-14. once again, I think these teams or a lot of the top programs at some of these smaller conferences need to try and get in with these bigger leagues. And they need to go to 16-team leagues with quadrants, kind of like I just stated out with the SEC, and have your own kind of little conference tournament for football, the top team from each quadrant. And that expands the playoff without destroying the regular season. In my opinion. Now, that does kind of leave these smaller conferences to fend for themselves. My thing is, it really feels like we just kind of need to realign the NCAA divisional structures in general, because half of the FBS aren't playing on the same playing field at this point. I think we've got a lot of programs that don't belong in the same conversation as the SEC, as the Big Ten. And even like the Pac-12 and the Big 12 and the American Athletic Conference even. Because I really don't think the MAC, for the most part, those teams aren't playing on the same playing field really as the AAC or maybe even the Sun, and they're barely playing on the same playing field as the Sun Belt right now. Like, the Sun Belt's really upped its game. So, I mean, of course, that's just my opinion. But I think like the bottom half of the Mountain West is barely on the same playing field as the top half of the Mountain West at this point. And I'd argue teams like Texas State, like Rice is moving to the American Athletic Conference. Their football team doesn't really belong in the FBS, as far as I'm concerned. And there are some teams in the FCS, which a number of those teams have been jumping up in recent years, like Appalachian State. One of the reasons North Dakota State's been able to really cement their hold over the FCS is Appalachian State moved up. Because Appalachian State was the big bad before North Dakota State. Like, they had a massive, big dynasty run. James Madison just jumped up from the or is jumping up from the FCS ranks this year. Or into the Sun Belt. They've won the FCS title just a few years ago. They're one of the two teams to beat North Dakota State for the national title in the last 11 years. Which, once again, they have a bigger playoff than the FBS playoff. The same team has won 9 of the last 11 years. Maybe it's not the system. Maybe it's just reality. Or should I say, maybe it's not the playoff structure. Maybe it's just that, some teams their investment level compared to their peers is just beyond. Because college football is not set up like the NFL. It's not set up to pull everyone together. Players have the ability to choose where they want to play at the college level. That's the other crazy thing. Players get to choose if they're good enough. But they have options. Players have options. In the NFL, you're drafted in the league where you're drafted if you're drafted. And then maybe someone wants you undrafted, but you're going to have to work your butt off to even get a chance to play. Or to, potentially get a spot on a practice squad, let alone a team if you're undrafted. And then there's money and other things. Maybe you want to stay somewhere, but you've become good enough to where, your team can only afford so many people, and they can't afford to pay you. So you've then got to go somewhere else. And maybe you have multiple offers on the table. But you don't necessarily get but you don't have the choice that you have as a college athlete. If you want to eschew Alabama, and if you're good enough, a 5-star player can go wherever the heck he wants. Anyone will give you if you called up a coach and said, I want to come play for you, they're going to hand you. And at most schools, if you're a 4-star guy and you say like, hey, I don't care about anyone else. I want to play for you. You're going to have a spot. I mean, we just saw the best top recruit in this year's recruiting class go to Jackson State, who's an FCS school, who I think they're looking to move up to the FBS eventually. But anyway, I really think we need to move towards some bigger conferences, like these 16-team conferences, and that's how you organically expand, like maybe a playoff structure, not through a complete playoff structure, expanding the college football playoff, but using your conference schedule and your regular season schedule to determine who gets to play for the conference title and therefore the ability to make the college football playoff. Not be guaranteed a spot in the college football playoff either, necessarily, because in my world there would probably end up with 6 conferences, maybe 7. Because I think the Sun Belt is growing and improving. I think the American Athletic Conference isn't going anywhere. I would argue that the Mountain West, the top teams need to go somewhere else, and the bottom teams need to be kicked down. I think the MAC, some of the top teams catch on somewhere, and the rest, are left down. I mean, this is the nature of competition. If you can't keep up, you just get left behind. I mean, at some point, you got to leave them behind. This ain't, just because you exist doesn't mean you get to play for the biggest prizes. Like, you have to invest at that level and you have to perform at that level. And you're not going to perform at that level if you're not investing at that level, because you're not going to draw that talent. You're not going to draw the kids. Because just like in everything, some people are better at things than other people. Because sometimes and some of it is genetic. Some people have better focus levels, they have better reaction times, they have better processing abilities for certain subjects or certain processes. Some people just spend so much time working on certain skills and understanding certain things that they are just better than other people at those things. And that's okay. No one should be upset by that. No one should be upset that not everyone's the same. People talk about diversity, but when I see people who talk about diversity, they look at it in a very non-diverse way, in my opinion, and they look at it in a very superficial way. Because to be honest, I feel like your diversity is a bunch of monoliths that assume that everyone with these characteristics is exactly the same in many cases. And heck, I mean, and people just in general, I hear some people who talk about diversity of thought. I said, yeah, but you don't really hang around anyone with a lot of opinions that differ from your own either. And that's okay. I'm actually not, I think people have every right to do whatever, in that regard, associate with who they want to. I don't think you should be forced to associate with people on a personal level that, you don't want to. Now, whether that's for good reasons or bad reasons, that's up to you. I probably wouldn't want to be around you if you're doing it for the wrong, if you're, like, who wants to be around a racist? But, I mean, that's free society. Huh, the way my camera is now, you can see my cat. Big old Willard. But with that being said, not everybody can play for the biggest prize, because not everybody's earned that right. And just because you play football, I mean, because by this response, like what I hear, like, more people need a shot, I'm like, well, I think North Dakota State deserves more of a shot at the FBS title in a given year than half the programs in the football bowl subdivision anyway. Because they're investing more than than a number of FBS schools are in their program. I mean, look at Appalachian State. Appalachian State jumped up. I think they might have had a little bit of a rough year one, but they're already, in less than a decade, or maybe in a decade, they're at the top of their conference, which is an ascending conference. I mean, there was a time where the Conference USA was considered better than the Sun Belt, where the MAC was considered better than the Sun Belt. So, and right now, I'd argue the Sun Belt is pushing to the level, I would say the baseline there is maybe better than the baseline of the Mountain West. Like, I don't know if their best teams might be on the level with the best teams of the Mountain West, but I think their worst team is probably better than the worst team in the Mountain West right now. And definitely better than the worst teams in the MAC. And it's definitely a tougher conference than the Conference USA, especially with the movement that's coming now down the pipe. So, and I see a lot of teams out in the Pac-12. Like, I mean, Arizona's struggling. I think Arizona State, there's a lot of investigation to stuff going on over there. I think they're about to be I think they could be in a world of hurt. Cal, I feel like Cal's they're a middling program now. UCLA didn't take advantage of this period where they could have risen to the top. Washington botched their last coaching hire, and I think there's been some investment issues that caused them to plateau even before that, which is why Chris Peterson decided to retire. Or one of the reasons Chris Peterson decided to retire. Washington State, I think, has also kind of made it clear that they're only going to invest to a certain level and that they have certain things they care about more than football and their athletic programs. So, I mean, that limits them. Oregon State's at this point, has a ceiling on them because of Oregon being next door. Like, there might be a year where they're better, in the future. I don't know where that's going to happen. I mean, I really like their coach, but I just feel like he's going to go somewhere, and they're going to have to nail the hire after him to keep whatever momentum they have, if this coach even continues it. Stanford certainly seems like they're kind of turning back into a middling program. I mean, it's really good. And Utah, Kyle Whittingham's not going to be there forever. Like, Kyle Whittingham's not a spring chicken. He was older than I thought. I say he's not a spring chicken, but I mean, like, he's older than I thought. And I still feel like Utah's kind of at their ceiling as a program. So, I don't know. Because some brands, like, you're able to continue to grow. Like, Tennessee has not been maximizing their brand. And, we've been spending fairly well, or, like, in terms of level of spending, but there's certain things we haven't done a good job of investing in, and because we're stuck in the past in a lot of ways. If you're not willing to keep up with the times in every area of your program, there's kind of like what's going on with the renovations of Neyland Stadium. We're making some drastic changes to a stadium that some people kind of feel like this is sacrilegious. It's like, I'm sorry, we don't need we don't need to be able to seat like 108,000 people this day and age. Like, especially if the game day experience is a drag when you're not in your seat. Like, if you have to go to the bathroom, like, I've been to that stadium. If you weren't in your seat, it was a pain in the freaking rear. If this helps that in any way, this is a good thing. So, but anyway, that's kind of my idea. Because I think what the SEC is doing, if they do this right, and to be honest, if they go with this pod structure and they expand a 9-game conference schedule, set up the way I did it, you can maybe jigger some of the teams around, whatever. But that outline, and then that, kind of conference little playoff structure at the end, I think that's the way things need. I think that's how things need to go. And I think it does some of the things. I think it's a better way of creating some of the, or kind of handling maybe the idea of an expanded playoff in a better way than what playoff expansionists are going to have happen. Because I think a lot of people don't realize you're just opening the door for 3 SEC and 3 Big Ten teams to make it, potentially. And you can say you can put all the limits on it you want or whatever to make sure or a bunch of conference champions get in. They'll just go to 12 teams and you'll end up the same thing. Or maybe a year where there's 4 SEC teams in and people will be whining and complaining, we got to change something. I'm like, I think this is the way you do it. But it might mean, making kind of another big split in the FBS. Elevating some of the conferences, knocking some of them down. Not that you can't play games in non-conference schedules, but this would kind of consolidate the conferences a little further apart maybe. And it would also have the benefit of bringing bowl games back as kind of a big deal because maybe you're not seeing as many big non-conference matchups under this formula. That might be the one downside some people see. But I think that would mean the bowl games are bigger, again, personally. And I don't think we should get rid of bowl games. I think bowl season's a good thing. And people need to pitch it as one last opportunity for star players, or not even star players, for every player, especially upperclassmen. This is a chance for upperclassmen to really show out one last time for scouts. And you know what? Okay, so some upperclassmen guys don't, or keep deciding to skip out. This is a showcase for these younger guys to come in and have a chance to show out before next season, to create some hype for themselves and their fan bases going into next year. And I don't think that's enough being said about bowl games. Oh, these guys are sitting out. Guess what? Other guys are getting to play. Heck, you're going to get, because of this, their upperclassmen that don't have as big a role get a bigger role for one game at the end of their careers. I think that's great. So, with that being said, I'm going to end the show today. I think we've had a pretty good show. Appreciate you tuning in. Please like the stream, like the VOD afterward if you don't mind, if you enjoyed the content at least. Leave a comment, talk about my idea, whatever. Give me some feedback on the show. Subscribe if you want more, and if you would like, follow me on Twitter at HunterK13. Eventually, what I need to do is I need to take this picture and I need to throw like my well, actually, eventually I'm going to have some graphics here, hopefully soon. I know I've been talking about it, but there's just been a lot of stuff going on that'll have all my social medias. I'm planning on doing some Instagram content, maybe starting up a TikTok. I really hope I don't start up a TikTok. Oh, God. But I am going to start doing some Instagram content, some little videos, which will probably end up being teasers for the show or just little random ideas throughout the day. I don't know. We'll see kind of where that goes. With that being said, I'm Hunter King. This has been BlindEyeLive, and I will see you tomorrow at hopefully 3 p.m. this time. I don't have anything push me at a different time. We'll just kind of shoot for that.